Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Speaks, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the present crisis. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Mayra Rivera. We'll be talking about the study of Apocalypticism and how it can help us understand the moment that we're in. Dr. Rivera is the president-elect of the American Academy of Religion. She teaches at Harvard University, where she is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Religion and Latinx Studies, the chair of Harvard's Standing Committee on Ethnicity, Rights, and Migration, and a member of the doctoral program in American Studies. In the interest of full disclosure, Mayra was, alongside Dan McCannon, the co-advisor of my own dissertation. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums to be a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Mayra, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I thought I would start out by just referencing a talk that you gave at Rice University back in February on how climate change and projections of the end of the world have imparted an apocalyptic mood to the contemporary moment. With the pandemic and global protests in response to the police murder of George Floyd and against police brutality and white supremacy, the apocalyptic mood today is, if anything, more pronounced than it was back when you gave your talk. So I just thought I'd ask if you could begin by talking about what apocalypticism is and how it might help us understand the moment we're in.
I've been thinking about apocalyptic narratives that as they are used in contemporary culture. So I've been surprised by how often we see references to apocalypse in the media, for instance. And so I started to become interested in what those references say about the world in the moment in which we find ourselves. Very often, the references to apocalypse in contemporary culture have to do with climate change, which was really what brought me to the theme. What do we mean when in popular culture we say we are facing apocalyptic times? And very often what is meant is that we are contemplating the possibility of the end, or how a scholar Eva Horn puts it, that we are looking at the future as if it were past us. So, and from that imaginary standpoint, we contemplate what is happening now. So I think that the question of climate change has prompted us to imagine that. But we are also inheriting traditions, particularly in the West, the traditions of the Book of Revelation and its reception throughout the centuries, that have addressed this imaginary of the end in ways that connect questions of colonialism and violence with the devastation of the earth. And it seems to me that at the present moment, we see an increased awareness of the precarity of the world in all of those areas, right? In terms of the precarity of the current political system, the violence and the devastation of the earth, not least through economic practices.
I guess one thing that's sort of implied in what you're saying, perhaps, but not fully brought forward, is that we are at a moment where there is a possibility of the end, or it seems like there's a possibility of the end. And is that always the case with apocalypticism, or are there some instances where people have apocalyptic thoughts, or instances where there is no real possibility of the end? It's just something that they're imagining?
I used to be very averse to any literatures that had apocalypticism, because so often it was a fantasy of a world destroyed that implied that we were secure in our position that the world will never end. So we could take pleasure in imagining this as an outrageous possibility, right? And I think that, again, that climate change has brought to the fore the possibility of such a substantial change to the earth that it might be the end of the world, or we might imagine it as the end of the world. But one of the things that I've been really interested in is the times in which this narrative of apocalypse represents other things. The times at which communities have legitimately addressed the end of their world, where the conditions that sustain their way of life has been destroyed to such an extent that they can say that their world has ended. So I'm interested in, even as we face this possibility of a planetary destruction, also to remember when colonized communities face the destruction of their ways of life, so that we begin to think about what is the long history of destruction, even when those destructions were more localized and had to do with particular communities. I think that the apocalyptic narratives have also been used to denounce, to make a judgment on a current situation, to say the world as it is too destructive and we need to bring it to an end. Right? The political system, for instance, is so devastating, but it's so immersed in our economic and ecological practices that we might say that world, that configuration of the world in particular, needs to end. And there's some literatures that have used apocalyptic tropes in that way. In fact, some see that the book of Revelation has that element, right? That element of confronting an oppressive power structure with this imaginary that this reign is gonna end.
So I guess there's a few things I want to ask you a little bit more in detail about. One is, I wonder if you could just sort of give an example of how apocalypticism is related to a local community and its responses or reactions to colonialism. Because you mentioned that, and I know you've done a lot of thinking about Puerto Rico because you're Puerto Rican, and done some research there on how Hurricane Maria has impacted the community and apocalyptic thought within the context of Puerto Rico. So I don't know if that's an example that you'd like to look into too, but I think expanding on or pulling apart one of the examples that you've researched might be helpful for people kind of thinking a little bit more concretely about what you're talking about.
Let me just to clarify say that I think mainly about three types of uses of the apocalypse, even though they're not mutually exclusive. One, which is the narrative that is predictive, right? The world will end. The narrative that is a denunciation, a call for the end of this world as it is, and then the narrative that is a lament, right? That our world has been destroyed. And I think one of the examples I often think about is the example of a Martinican writer, Aimé Césaire, who was writing in the process of an anti-colonial movement. And he made the claim that we need to begin, and the way to begin is the end of the world. By which he meant the way to begin was the destruction of a system of life that was imposed by French colonialism. And there were at other points in the history of the Caribbean narratives and even movements, apocalyptic movements that sought precisely either to escape or to bring down the colonial system that was oppressing them. I've been more recently interested in that genre of end of the world as lament. Right? And that emerged for me right after the devastation of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And some of you might know that for a long time there were great discrepancies on the reports about the number of deaths caused by the hurricane, and there was an outcry from the population to not only to count the dead, but to have public mourning for the dead. And there's a well-known artist in Puerto Rico. His name is Antonio Martorell. And he did an art exhibition based on obituaries. And so recreated obituaries that had never been written, right? As a collective art of mourning that replaced what the government had failed to do. And a lot of the writing coming out of that experience has had a complex relationship with the end of the world. Some of it seeing it clearly as the end of a particular world, the end of a particular vision of the world that has surfaced, a reality hidden to the people, a reality about their own vulnerability and their invisibility in relation to the United States and its political power. So I think, as I think about those, I think two elements that I want to highlight beyond the more common assumptions of apocalypse and prediction, are the elements of the long history of communities that have ended, the ways of life that have been destroyed, and the importance of lament. And lament sometimes take the form of a public acknowledgement that some things have been lost.
So, with all of that sort of framework about apocalypticism and the sort of three different ways of thinking about it, and this example from Puerto Rico and of communities that have been destroyed and laments, I'm wondering, do you think that we're in an apocalyptic moment? Do you think that apocalypticism is a helpful way to think about the sort of intertwined pandemics of white supremacy and the novel coronavirus? And I would also add to that the rise of authoritarianism. Or do you think that it's not a helpful framework?
It's helpful if we think about it as revelation for once. The catastrophe has reached a point where it unveils realities that have been there, but perhaps not so open, right? Not so visible to all of us. So it is both a moment in which we see the possibility of a collapse in many institutions we've trusted, but we also see in that very process the unveiling of the devastation that has been happening, right? So that it is important to see it as the confluence of patterns of destruction that come together at this moment and make it unique, but also to see the long history that has brought us here, because it is that history that will help us move forward, right? To see this not as an accident, but really as the confluence of many factors that have been in place for a long time.
I think that that's actually really helpful to think about apocalypse as something that's located in historical time. I mean, even thinking about the book of Revelation, which you referenced earlier, there's a way in which it's responding to the various crises, various political moments in the Roman Empire, and sort of situating this sort of hope for the end of the world, prediction of the end of the world, fear of the end of the world, transformation at the end of the world within a historical moment where history in some sense will be, I guess I would say, ruptured and changed, right? Like, so there's this really interesting moment right now where something that even 2 weeks ago, the abolition of policing or the fundamental transformation of policing in this country wouldn't have even been possible to think about. And, just recently the Minneapolis City Council voted to essentially eliminate their police department. And so, I don't know, I wanted to kind of lift up that connection between historical time and apocalypticism, because I guess a lot of religious narratives don't necessarily seem like they're located in our historical reality, but apocalypticism seems to be almost responding to it in some sort of way as an attempt to both acknowledge that one is located in history and often to try to escape or move to a different point in history.
Absolutely. And I think that it also helps us understand where these narratives come from, right? What are they trying to articulate? Even the narrative in the book of Revelation, right? They're expressing a certain demand for transformation, a certain demand for the end, and also expressing the destruction that has been brought about. And I think if we think about the present moment, we can see also how the protests bring together the necessity of public lament, right? Those deaths that are not recognized, right? That are, it's both the injustice and the value of the life that is not publicly recognized, and the protests bring that to the fore. And at the same time, as they proclaim the end of particular ways of being, in this case, the police, but also beyond the police, right? We're talking about the violence brought about, say, through on the inequalities in the healthcare system, right? The inequalities in the economic system that makes particular communities most vulnerable. So all of those things are both, so there's a need of a recognition of the damage that it has done, and then a call for transformation.
Which I think touches back on this idea of apocalypse and unveiling, which you referenced earlier, and the idea that in an apocalyptic moment, structures that, or ways of being that are not normally seen, or people often ignore, are forced into view. And I mean, I think that within the context of the pandemic, we've seen both this conversation about essential workers, emerge, which it turns out that like many of the people that are often sort of attacked in the media as being not particularly valuable to society are actually necessary to make it function.
Yeah.
Who but anybody who's read Karl Marx and vast amounts of or just paid attention to reality would have known that. Oh my gosh. But at the same time, the sort of systemic racism, which again is something that I think a lot of people have willfully, and I should just say a lot of white people for the most part, have willfully turned an eye against, or is forced into view. It's this key aspect of apocalypse, and I think that given the way that the pandemic is sort of going, it does have this moment of me wondering what else is going to sort of be unveiled in the next 3 months, 6 months. You and I were talking before we started recording this about how difficult it is to plan anything right now, because it's like everything just kind of constantly is in flux.
And I think part of the unveiling is also all those structures that we thought would save us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The trust we had in government that would respond to a pandemic. And I've often said that this is a realization, or was part of the realization, that Puerto Ricans wrestled with right after Hurricane Maria, right? The total abandonment from the government in the U.S. And so I think that's also a moment of revelation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that this whole moment has opened up is a question about how should society be organized, and for whom should society be organized. And and a conversation I wish was happening a bit more of is who is responsible for making some of the decisions that have resulted in the situation we're in, right? Because different sets of decisions could have been made at various points by political leaders that would have had a different impact on how the pandemic has played out. I mean, you've got the defunding of aspects of the CDC, especially those that relate to pandemic response by the Trump administration. You've got his delay in refusing to admit that it's like a significant issue. And then you've also got like the fact that, people from communities of color, I mean, Black Lives Matter as a movement started in 2014, and it's not like the struggle against police violence and unjust policing began in 2014. I mean, those have been issues that have been going on for, 400 plus years at this point, right? Mm-hmm. And so, how do we get to that conversation is sort of something I'd like to hear a little bit more of, because I think that if we're going to actually see change, if it's going to be it's going to be truly an apocalyptic moment in the sense that it shifts historical time or the way that humans relate to history or the world that we're in, then we need to point some fingers and change some stuff.
I think one of the things that we need to think more carefully is how we've inherited ways of thinking that are totalizing. Right? Even when we talk about the end of the world, we think that unless it affects everybody on the planet, it's not the end of the world. Right? Mm. And that's a way of erasing the realities that particular communities face. Mm-hmm. So I think when we think about the response to the pandemic, for instance, I think it's broadly recognized that there needed to be a more comprehensive set of guidelines, right? An early guideline preparation for the response, right? And in the lack of that, I wonder if it responds to a sense of invulnerability, right? Mm-hmm. That these things don't happen in the United States. They happen in other countries, but not in the United States. But I think there's another element. Here in Massachusetts, for instance, there was an initial sense that things were under control, and then there was an incredible spike precisely in the areas of communities of color. And we need to learn also to think about particularities of communities. Right? Mm-hmm. So not only the broad guidelines, which are crucial, but also how do we take into account the specific needs and the specific vulnerabilities of communities. And I think that's something that the local governments can do. I think that also religious leaders can help with that, right? Who are going to be voices that help us understand what are the specific needs of specific communities. And I think about this also in relation to climate change, right? On the one hand, yes, we need global policies to help us slow down climate change. But we also need to consider the specificities of the effects in particular places and for particular communities. So otherwise, we end up, again, ignoring specific communities when creating global projects.
So we are nearing the end of our discussion, and I want to actually narrow in on something that you just referenced, which was religious leaders, because you are a professor at Harvard Divinity School and also the president-elect of the American Academy of Religion. And I'm wondering what, if any, reflections you have on how religious communities and religious leaders should be responding to these times.
I think that one of the key elements of this is to really center the ethical dimensions of the call of religious leaders, right? And to do so in relating their communities to the broader world, right? So both in terms of how do their particular communities respond to the problems and the challenges of the broader society, but also to articulate publicly the needs of specific communities. So I think that, going back to the question of apocalypse that I mentioned before, to the religious leaders can facilitate this very necessary acts of lament, right? Mm-hmm. That are also acts through which we assert the value of lives and the value of ways of life, and also then speak boldly about the traditions that inform them and that have in the past articulated these calls for deep, lasting transformation.
Well, I will certainly be considering that as I continue in my efforts to lead the First Unitarian Universalist of Church of Houston throughout this time. And I think that centering the ethical dimension and thinking about the sort of deep connections and deep issues is absolutely essential to trying to figure out how we are supposed to respond. And I guess this video is being released on Wednesday. On Monday, which is the day we're recording it, we're also releasing a lament about police brutality and white supremacy and a prayer to end those that says the names of many of the victims of police brutality. So I hope our viewers will take a chance to look at that as an offer of a kind of lament that a religious community can offer at this moment. Thank you, Mayra, so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
It was absolutely a pleasure. And for all of our viewers, if you found this video to be helpful, I hope you'll consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central Daylight Time and features music and prayer in addition to a sermon. This week I'm preaching on the rainbow sign and reflecting on how the struggles of the past can inform the struggles of today. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as possible to gather again. Please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together.